Hi, everyone. Good morning, almost afternoon. I know I'm standing between you and the very delicious coffee here. I was in the US last week and I had such a bad experience with the coffee. So I am so glad that I'm here with all of you. I was really touched by all the presentations, inspired and really stimulated, but especially touched by what Dana talked about this morning. And actually, I want to begin with another story, and I'll come back to this. The story I want to begin with is something that I don't really think a lot about. My father spent a lot of time with me when I was a child, more than my mother, because my mother was working more. But my father actually had a lot of adverse childhood experiences. So I was thinking about, the 4 or more ACEs. And actually, I think he would categorize as that, growing up poor, having a mother who suffered from domestic abuse, also hit by his siblings who were venting out their anger on the youngest brother. But he got rid of all that, and he was so strong, and he decided that he wouldn't replicate the vicious cycle, and he's the best father that I could ever ask for. And I think for me, the title of my speech today is Breaking Biases for Bold Leadership. And I think my father is really an example of a bold leader. For me, boldness is really deciding to say no to injustice and finding another way out. And I just want to start with his example, because without him and his courageous leadership and his trust in me, I wouldn't be where I am today. So yeah, please join me in just thanking my father and all of you, who I'm sure are amazing parents and doing kind of different ways of leadership and showing up for your community. But what I originally wanted to share, and another example of where I'm coming from in terms of bold leadership, this picture was 6 years ago. I hope I haven't aged very much since since this picture was taken. That was me when I was 20 years old in Pakistan. I had this idea of providing platforms and channels for marginalized women and girls to express themselves. And like Diana, I can't pronounce your first name, I'm sorry, I am very much a women's empowerment advocate, and that kind of came to me, as I'll share with you later on. But this was my first time actually implementing my idea in a community that was very foreign to me, and I had a lot of people locally who were helping me. And this picture, why I really want to share this, is this young child here, her name's Aisha, she was 11 at that time. And when she was pressing the camera shutter for the very first time, and I look back at this picture and how you could see curiosity in her eyes and how her eyes were sparkling, it really made me think about how at that moment of pressing the shutter, that she also had the courage to redefine her world differently. And for me, that's boldness. And for me, that is the essence of all the work that we are doing to change the world, and how often this courageous act of redefining and reimagining is not found in the leaders we see today. So I want to start kind of let this picture sink in and let you also absorb the power of her gaze and the power that she had. So I want to turn to Slido, and let's just kind of try whether this works. But if not, we'll kind of do this physically. So the question that I want to frame our discussion today is, how many of you think we have a crisis in leadership today? I'm really curious in the 4% no, and I would love to chat with those of you afterwards, and maybe we'll have a dose of optimism. Now that's going down, 1%. So I come to this topic of boldness in leadership because fundamentally we do have a crisis in leadership. We need some dramatic shifts in this notion of leadership. And we also need just more diversity in who become leaders. So a colleague who is a white man in his early 60s always tells me, like he sprinkles this in conversations, is that he thinks the world will be less censored words today if we had more female leaders. So that's coming from a white man, and I kind of think it's half jokingly that he said that, to encourage me, but I think also half seriously that maybe our world will really be a better place if it was led by more women, more diverse people from diverse places of the world. So if we go back to my slides, the dictionary definition of boldness is the willingness to take risks and act innovatively. So that kind of sums up what we talked about this morning. And it's, I think, quite timely for us to have this thinking now before you go to tea time, because how can we bring all these big concepts and all these big problems we see to who we are as individuals and as groups of individuals? And really let that introspection kind of follow through as you listen through this talk. I'll share an example from my history, Chinese history. I want to thank Abdul yesterday when you put up the word listen. I was very happy because that was something I could really resonate with. I want to share this example because she was the first person that really made me think about feminism and to be able to resonate with it. So her name is Chiu. She was nicknamed the female knight of Mirror Lake, so that's her on the right. And she was fighting against patriarchy, and we had some very bad kind of traditions, like on the right, sorry if it's a bit disgusting, but it's this female foot binding tradition that existed for centuries, I think for over 1,000 years actually in Chinese culture. It only was kind of outlawed in 1911 when the Qing dynasty was kind of got out of the way and China became a republic. But she was fighting against all these traditions and also fighting for democracy in China in the late 19th century. She was an early feminist, and she brought feminism into the fold of Chinese culture to say that we can be Chinese as well as being feminist, and there's no contradictions in kind of the fight for gender equality in our culture. For me, that was very inspiring. But she was only 32 when she was beheaded by the late Qing government at that time. And so I think about her and I think about this concept of boldness. Not only was she not rewarded for being bold and like doing something different, she was punished more severely than her male counterparts. And unless people study gender history, or Chinese history for that matter, as history is often quite Eurocentric, people won't know about her story. So I think what I want to really us to reflect on is, are there bold leaders in who we know, in the work that you do, who have been erased from history because of all these biases that we have about who is a leader and who's not? Another example, and this is not just Chinese culture, is actually even Western culture, which seeks to portray itself as more progressive than other cultures. Mary Bead, a British classicist, she wrote a very powerful book, more a manifesto called Women in Power. Has anyone seen the book or heard about the book? Yeah, a few. So it decried gender injustice, and it tried to talk about how misogyny is deeply ingrained in Western culture and history. So one of the stories that was really brutal, and sorry again for, I seem to have this draw towards brutalities, but this is an example of Philomena. It's just a picture, like a painting about this story from a Greek mythology. So apparently Philomela was raped by the king, who was the husband of her sister. So she was obviously really upset, and she threatened to tell her sister about what happened. So the king was obviously really angry, and he threatened her not to tell the sister. She said no, and then he pulled out her tongue so that she wouldn't say anything. And there was another example in the book about, I forgot Greek or Roman, but all the same to me, that a son who was about to be king after the father died was also pulling out the tongue of his mother because his mother was trying to challenge his authority. So this like brutal act of pulling out the tongue, which I don't think happens in my culture, but obviously in Roman and Greek. But it's about this wanting to take away someone's voice. And when women are being bold in history, that they are so severely punished. And what gives men kind of this notion they can just take away someone's voice, but also maybe we are in our own being, also taking away someone's voice, whether we are consciously doing it or not. So I want you to reflect on how, this agency, our agency is so often expressed through our voice. And think about instances where maybe you've unconsciously taken away the voice from someone. Or maybe when your voice is taken away by someone else. And I think what these two stories talked about, the story of Chiu and this stories and many other stories, is really about how boldness is actually not a desirable trait in patriarchal societies that we live in. And we need to acknowledge that the real dangers that bold people, but especially bold women, face, and how we can work actively to break those biases. Because we really need bold leadership. And so I asked, kind of moving on, how can we have boldness in leadership? So I asked my husband about it, and he said something that I thought was really smart, but I'm also quite biased because he's my husband. So he said, boldness is control B. Okay, good. So for those of you who interact a lot with Microsoft Office, I hope you understand that kind of how the boldness thing works. But he then goes on to say, can you have boldness without control? And I thought that was a really smart question to ask, because can we? I mean, a lot of people are driven to be bold because they don't have control. But to what extent can your boldness translate into action if you don't have that real control? And when we reflect on marginalized populations, women, people of color, people with disabilities, and people who are at the intersection of all that, how can they be in control of the resources and to be bold? I want to share this example because I was really inspired when I found out about it. The world's oldest university and library was actually based in Morocco, and it's founded by two women. So that was something I came across. But the story goes that they then didn't end up leading the university or ended up being in control. So even if, marginalized people get the opportunity to start something, they are not then in control. So let's pause here and go back to Slido and reflect on what are some of the barriers for you to become more bold in your work. What's holding you back? And I think we can't do multiple choice, so it's only multiple choice, you can't do multiple ones. So just pick the ones that resonate the most to you as the biggest barrier. And this is more just for you to reflect on what is holding you back, and hopefully during the session with your navigators, you can really absorb and think about what can you do or what can we do as a collective to help you become bolder. But for me, lack of confidence, very much that was actually my biggest barrier, if we turn back to the slides, for me to be bold for a very long time. But I think I got back to a point when I just stopped caring. And I did my first TEDx talk 2 years after the first picture you saw of this moment. So I did my first TEDx talk, and someone told me very recently, a few months ago, that he watched it, and then he said to me, "Wow, I thought you were really bold in your TEDx talk." And I guess the reason why I was bold was I started the TEDx talk with these statements. I said, "I consider myself a feminist, but I'm also a Chinese woman from Hong Kong, where feminism is rarely discussed." I also said, "I am 22 years old, from a culture where age prescribes authority." So that was how I started the TEDx talk. And he said to me that he thought I was being really bold. So I thought that was really interesting. And, part of being bold is stressing really who you are and try to make the point that people should listen to you despite all those differences. And I was being assertive, but I'm also sure that a lot of people kind of watched the TEDx talk, and maybe my assertiveness came off as aggressiveness because of all these biases we have in leaders. So I wrote on Forbes earlier this year about this campaign by Catalyst. So Catalyst is a gender equality kind of think tank, and they wanted to visualize the biases that we have in female leaders. So they interviewed female leaders and they asked them to name the most visceral or negative adjective that people use to describe themselves. For Asian leaders, like women who look like me, often the adjective being used is shy or timid. But for Black women, the adjective that's being named is aggressive. So what this campaign seeks to do is show our biases, and that aggressive is, of course, also a synonym with assertive, because if a man behaves this way, then we wouldn't use that adjective to be describing them. And so as I do more work in gender equality, I think a lot about the intersection between race and gender, and how we can actively acknowledge our biases. And I came across this quote because we all came up with so many quotes during this morning. Madeleine Albright, the first female US Secretary of State, she famously said, "It took me quite a long time to develop a voice, but once I have it, I'm not going to be silent." And so, but this quote is coming from someone who has that privilege to not be shut down. And so I want us just to reflect on, if we are someone who feels our voice is being actively shut down, what can we do to find those allies who can help us? But also, if you acknowledge your privilege and you look out for people whose voices are being shut down just by who they are, that I think we can move much closer to boldness. I think we have to break those biases because we don't have much time, and we know from examples, especially this year, how really, really young women and boys are putting us to shame by just going out there and doing so much action on climate. I've spoken to teenagers who are 16 years old who are developing apps to be tackling climate change or tackling gender-based violence. And I learned from them that being bold is taking actions on what you're passionate about and not asking for or waiting for approval. And Greta Thunberg obviously is a great example of someone being really bold in the climate change movement. And I also want you to meet Yasule. She's from Ghana. We profiled her in my organization, Lensational. We created this photo book profiling stories of women who are driving climate action in their communities across 3 African countries and China. Yasule's story, she's in her 60s, and every day she collects plastics in Ghana where they put water in small sachets, and that creates a lot of waste. So she collects those, and every day she collects 5 bags, big bags of that. And she's really a great example of a leader because when we profile her, she has a lot of things to say about her community and climate change, what she thinks should be different. And she keeps telling us about how women are doing so much in climate action, but often their voices are not taken into account when governments convene different roundtables to collect community voices. And then when I think about these examples of, Greta, about Yasule, I think about why we meet all these bold leaders in our grassroots communities, but not in government institutions or not in big businesses, not in multinational corporations like the UN. Like, why do we not have boldness in those formal layers of leadership? I really think that there should be boldness everywhere, and leaders should be actively rewarded for it. Because if there's one thing that boldness can help us achieve, it is to have a different future and we need a different future. I think that's why we're all here today. And I want to end with this really uplifting picture from 1st of January this year. It is the picture that shows this incredible campaign that 5 million women participated in Kerala in India earlier this year. They were protesting against this temple banning women of menstruating age from entering. And so 5 million women just got to the streets. I really don't know how logistically they put it off, but they formed this human chain that was probably as long as from New York to Washington, D.C. So really amazing. Because bold leadership, I think you hear from my examples, individual bold leaders, especially women, women of color, people with disabilities, people of color, they do face a lot of dangers when they try to be bold. But if we act as a collective, like these 5 million Kerala women going onto the streets, we perhaps can be safer. So it's not just about us as individual leaders in our own community, in our own organizations, but also us as bold leaders as a collective, how we can openly defy the injustice that we see in the world, how we can actively defy the status quo. And also, how can we actively defy some of the inner inhibitions in ourselves to be a better leader. So I would like us today, get inspiration from these incredible women with one another, that let's go and form a global collective of bold leadership. Thank you very much.